Dear Black women, I heard about you in the news the other day. They said you caused the planes to fall in D.C., that the economy was on fire because of you, that you made those kids shoot each other in Chicago. When I open up social media, I hear podcaster after rapper, after comedian, after president with something negative to say about you. These guys sure as hell don't like you. Well, aside from Dr. Umar. I've heard everything from you're weak, aggressive, hard-headed, a bad partner, and sexually attractive. What a contradiction these guys imagine you as. But why? For a subgroup so commonly discussed, there's an awful lack of you being represented in this conversation. It seems your identity has been hijacked. For centuries, caricatures have taken your place. With time, these false idols have evolved, changed to suit the goals of their creators. And today, these lies are synthesized in convoluted and often contradicting depictions of Black women in the white and male imaginary. But it doesn't have to be this way. We can emancipate the Black woman identity, empower you to self-identify in a way caricatures have never shown. But it requires what for so long you've never been given: the spotlight. The opportunity to showcase who you are and not be told what you are. But we'll get there. Long before I can platform and free my Black sisters, I have to destroy their image. The image that's been covering who they really are for well over 100 years. Today, I have the task of spotlighting these imposters, exposing how their personas came to be, why they were created, and the immense pain they've caused Black women. In the destruction of this image, I want society to give Black women a clean slate. A slate that Black women can rebuild and retell in their image. Welcome. I'm the librarian, and you are listening to the Garden Library. This is a blogcast that tackles a variety of topics with a skew towards climate and environmental policy. This is Lesson 2 of the Black History Month special, Living History and Forgotten Truths. Today's lesson is on caricatures. Black women's transient identity is deeply rooted to the power structure of slavery and patriarchy. But our lesson takes us to the beginning, long before even chattel slavery, with that of the hypersexual and seductive Jezebel. White society has long seen African women as hypersexual. Historian Deborah Gray White, in her book Aren't I a Woman? Female Slaves in the Plantation South, detailed the perspective of 17th century European travelers and proto-enslavers. Unaccustomed to the requirements of a tropical climate, Europeans mistook semi-nudity for lewdness. Similarly, they misinterpreted African cultural traditions so that polygamy was attributed to Africans' uncontrolled lust, tribal dances were reduced to the level of an orgy, and African religions lost the sacredness that had sustained generations of ancestral worshippers. End quote. It was these and other early depictions of African women by Europeans that birthed the stereotype of Black women as the barbaric Jezebel. But who is Jezebel? The name Jezebel has a biblical origin. She was a Phoenician princess turned queen after her marriage to the king of Israel, and her life was filled with deceit, immorality, and wickedness. Jezebel worshipped the Canaanite god of Baal instead of Yahweh, the Hebrew God. She persecuted Yahweh's prophets, and in one instance, after the Jezreelite Naboth refused to sell his vineyard to her husband Ahab, the king of Israel, Jezebel hatched a plot to falsely accuse him of blasphemy and had him stoned to death, just so that they could get this man's vineyard that, mind you, he inherited from his father, all so that they could make this vineyard a vegetable garden. Jezebel was and continues to be used as a catch-all term referring to a woman who is immoral. This stereotype of the Jezebel whore 100 years later, was used to rationalize the commonplace rape of enslaved and free black women. If black women could be categorized as having an animal-like, quote, insatiable sex drive, then not only would the actions of white men not be wrong, but it would be those Jezebels who actually forced and coerced it onto them. This is an important perspective, given how often white slave owners, behind the backs of their wives, would take enslaved black women as their concubine, which, as effed up as that dynamic was, forcing enslaved black women to between the rock of rape by their white masters and abuse, if not outright murder, by their master's wife, somehow that aspect is less gross than the way Jezebel was capitalized on by the institution of slavery. Under chattel slavery, the Jezebel caricature was paired with the notion of breeding. And I recommend you don't eat anything during this next part because it gets really disgusting. In 1808, the United States banned participation in the international slave trade, meaning, by and large, new slaves couldn't be brought into America, at least legally. Plantation owners had to find a way to acquire new slaves to fill their ever-aging, dying, and escaping supply. To resolve this problem, and the image of Jezebel in their mind, they turned to the black woman. In theory, black women and their animal-like sex drive, their high fertility, meant they were capable of reproducing the supply of slaves plantation owners needed to suffice the increased labor demand. In practice, though, plantation owners had to find a way to ensure black women reproduced fast enough, and plantation owners certainly did. Very quickly, a new dynamic formed in the slave economy, that of breeders, breeding slaves, and childbearing women. All of a sudden, that systemic design of slavery that birthed accounting was turned towards the bodies of black women. Plantation owners would pay top dollar and carefully select black men who'd have good genes. They would then force them to impregnate black women. Especially fertile and childbearing black women would be some of the most expensive things auctioned off during this time. These women would be sold out to give birth to new slaves for one plantation, resold to do the same at the next, and discarded of once they could no longer do so. By and large, black women existed in unending pregnancy, a culture where, by any means necessary, they would be giving birth to new labor. Black women were a crop plantation owners wished to always bear fruit, which meant if they didn't naturally, they would be artificially fertilized. Make no mistake, though white history dubs these actions breeding, these women breeders, and these sites breeding farms, in truth, these were rape farms. These were rape victims, and they were being raped. White society cultivated the most violent, vile, and widespread rape culture ever seen. If black men wouldn't do it, and even when they did, overseers and plantation owners would rape black women themselves. It didn't matter who or how they got pregnant, as long as they were pregnant. Grossly enough, despite the non-existent notion of consent, this raper-rapee dynamic further fueled the depiction of the lustful Jezebel. Imagine forcefully raping a population of people and calling them lustful whores after the fact. It was insanity. But there's one aspect I've decided not to mention until now, due to just how upsetting it is. The caricature of the Jezebel black woman was not exclusive to black adults. Unfortunately, it applied most regularly to young black girls. Girls would be groomed and sold for the breeder role from as young as 6, forcefully made pregnant at 12, and sexually abused and made to give birth until death. In the autobiography of Harriet Ann Jacobs, a formerly enslaved woman, she describes her experience with sexual abuse as a young teenager. Quote, "He told me I was his property, that I must be subject to his will in all things. My soul revolted against the mean tyranny. But where could I turn to for protection? No matter whether the slave girl be as black as ebony or as fair as her mistress, in either case there is no shadow of law to protect her from insult, from violence, or even from death. All these are inflicted by fiends who bear the shape of men. The mistress, who ought to protect the helpless victim, has no other feelings towards her but those of jealousy and rage." End quote. I couldn't imagine the pain Jacobs went through as a young girl. The fear of knowing every man wishes to violate you and use your body for their own gain, and what few women existed either despised you or suffered your same fate. The process of research for this was grueling, and I can't bring myself to read some of the more harrowing stories that exist. But know this: slave masters regularly forced nudity for their underage enslaved girls, instilled in them the virtue of their fertility, and humiliated and degraded these black girls daily. One overseer even went so far as to sexually whip a child just for the hell of it. To make a whore out of a woman, out of a child. That is the history of Jezebel. Black girls are still seen as the caricature of Jezebel. Today we see teen pregnancies, rape, sexual harassment all propagate in the black community. Horrifyingly, the same witch-like rationalization enslavers used to justify their non-consensual sexual actions with black women has now been remixed by modern-day abusers and denialists. The notions of "what was she wearing" or "she wanted it," and that of young black girls being quote-unquote fast attempt to legitimize and rationalize their abuse. And this is within the black community. These are black aunties, uncles, mothers, and fathers protecting and defending the abuser rather than the abused. For a society that has come so far and a people who have experienced so much, the way Jezebel remains an active part of our community sickens me. These same abused black girls now grow up and for the rest of their life face constant sexualization and threat by those who see in every doechii a Jezebel that no matter what happens to her, she's to blame. In 2021, I was shocked to learn a longtime staple of my and many black households, Aunt Jemima syrup, would be pulled from the shelves and rebranded. Even my 95-year-old grandma was surprised to learn the syrup, which hasn't changed in well over a century, finally got around to rebranding. The newly branded Pearl Milling Company, while a business decision, was a great learning opportunity to many about the history of Aunt Jemima. In 1888, Chris L. Rutt founded his company Aunt Jemima based off of an 1875 minstrel show song called Old Aunt Jemima. Unfortunately, Rutt and his business partner lacked the money to properly advertise and market their pancake mix, and sold the company off soon after. After selling off the company, the new owners improved upon the recipe, but more importantly, kept its branding, this time going so far as to hire a real-life Aunt Jemima. Nancy Green, a former enslaved woman turned maid, was hired to represent the brand. In a risky move, the company funneled all of their money into an exhibition at the 1893 World Exposition in Chicago that saw Miss Green making pancakes, singing songs, and acting out lines of her wonderful time in the Old South. The risk turned profit, and quickly Aunt Jemima became a nationwide staple, as Miss Green was called on to represent Aunt Jemima all over the country at stores, shows, fairs, you name it. By 1910, more than 120 million Aunt Jemima breakfasts were served annually. When I heard about this backstory, I felt betrayed. What was this goddamn nonsense that they got away with, and why was such a blatantly racist caricature allowed to exist for so long? It was on my shelf. This took me down the rabbit hole of one of the most pervasive, profitable, and nonsensical caricatures ever created about black women. Mammy. Mammy is a depiction of a heavy-set, older black woman who cheerfully and loyally tends to her master's family. As the staple of enslaved domestic work, Mammy always had a big smile, an apron, a scarf, and the darkest skin white people could imagine. Mammy as a caricature, aside from the handful of recorded instances where black women ever acted as a loyal right hand to a plantation owner, existed in well-crafted marketing and pro-slavery propaganda. Mammy served as a way to rationalize slavery, showcase how content and happy blacks were underneath it. Never being depicted as a Jezebel or a victim, Mammy was a good Negro, a happy Negro, and one of those Negroes that white people loved. And I do mean loved. Mammy appeared on products of all kinds: baking powders, coffee, ashtrays, detergents, planters, molasses. In the same way celebrities of today are a source of comfort and trust to consumers, Mammy to white America was a face they knew and could trust. After all, Mammy was a Negro who treated white people better than they did themselves. But Mammy didn't exist, at least as white society remembered her during slavery. But Mammy was a Negro so loved that whites were willing to create her. And create her they did. In the aftermath of the Civil War, black women had to find forms of employment to survive. But even more so than black men, they found it incredibly difficult to find a job. At the time, women of all kinds weren't seen as an active member of the labor force, which meant black women had an especially small pool to pull from. Luckily for them, the Mammy caricature in white society was pervasive, with newfound openings in domestic maids and workings being almost exclusively given to black women. To quote civil rights movement biographer Joanne Gibson Robinson, jobs for clerks in dime stores, cashiers in markets, and telephone operators were numerous, but were not open to black women. A $50 a week worker could employ a black domestic woman to clean her home, cook the food, wash and iron clothes, and nurse the baby for as little as $20 a week. White society didn't stumble upon Mammy in real life. They crafted the economy and labor market in her image. It wasn't until the 1960s and 1970s, when Jim Crow was largely dismantled and black women finally had economic freedom, were they able to leave domestic work. And they left. In 1950, 42% of all domestic workers in America were black women. In 1980, that number fell to around 6%. Mammy was an artificially created stereotype used to depict a monolith of black women that never existed. And once white society lost the chains to Mammy, were the real black women kept down by that story able to flourish. By far the most popular stereotype in modern America is that of the angry black woman. Okay, my grandma is a huge fan of tennis, and growing up I was too. By far, favorite tennis players were Venus and Serena Williams. So you know I was an expert on all things these two. Serena especially was my sports idol. The sheer power and passion she had for her craft, the way in which she was blending fitness and finesse into a victory, it was the best I ever seen. But there was one moment when my GOAT was put on the back foot. It was 2018 and Serena Williams was up against Naomi Osaka in the US Open Finals. In the second set, umpire Carlos Ramos gave Serena a code violation due to a signal from her coach, which Williams believed to just be a thumbs-up gesture. Now, this coaching violation brings with it the smudge of cheating, a smudge Williams did not take lightly. Remember, Williams as a woman, a black woman at that, has had a long career full of doubters, deniers, and haters trying to crack at her legacy. To Williams, this smudge meant something more, and she understandably wanted it handled. Serena demanded that the umpire apologize and remained frustrated throughout the match when he did not. At one point, The frustration got to Williams, and she breaks a racket onto the floor, which, for context, is done all the goddamn time in tennis. Nonetheless, the umpire gave Williams a full point penalty, which again, understandably upset Williams, who then called the umpire a thief. And it was that phrase that caused the umpire to give Williams a full game penalty and lose the match. The final match of a very close U.S. Open. The press around this incident sparked an intense debate about Williams' actions and the accusation that she was just an angry black woman. A cartoonist for the Herald Sun depicted this incident with Williams as a big angry black woman with big lips throwing a tantrum with the quote, "Can you just let her win?" Thankfully, the tennis world agreed that the umpire was out of his mind, and even the Women's Tennis Association noted that his actions couldn't be anything other than sexism or racism. The reason I mention this story is because it demonstrates so effortlessly how historical stereotypes manifest in markedly negative ways for black women. In this instance, the pervasive angry black woman is used to devalue and silence critiques and dissent of black women. And this time, our history takes us to the caricature of the sapphire. Remember the mammy stereotype? Well, there was one thing she wasn't kind or caring to, and that was the black man. The sassy mammy was a depiction of a mammy wherein she was domineering and rude to black men and children. This stereotype would later be riffed upon in the 1950s by part minstrel show, part radio show, part situational comedy, Amos and Andy. This all-white cast of a show did its best at trying to depict black people the only way white people knew how, with the most racist and stereotypical content they can imagine. In it, character Sapphire Stevens was married to a guy named Kingfish, who was basically the embodiment of a League of Legends player. The guy was confused, unemployed, lazy, exploitative, broke, and had nothing going on upstairs. Kingfish was the perfect arbiter of how white people saw black men. In Sapphire's case, this no-good was a perfect target for her anger, as Sapphire would constantly berate Kingfish, and it was her vocalized disgust and critique that was the first incarnation of the modern angry black woman. But it wasn't until the 1960s and the 1970s where the angry black woman as we knew her came to be. Sitcoms in the late 20th century really began to lean in on this whole black representation, but stereotypical black is the joke narrative of old minstrel shows. As television sitcoms produced with even black casts became the norm, so too did Sapphire as a character trope. Sanford and Son, The Good Times, The Jeffersons, Martin, Everybody Hates Chris. It seemed an angry black woman would appear regularly in almost all productions. As this coincided with the civil rights movement and the rise of blaxploitation in film, the angry black woman stereotype took its modern colors and had its first task against the black woman: delegitimize her struggle. As movies, shows, and pop culture saw angry black women as funny and a reoccurring bit, in real life, she was seen in the activist writers and revolutionaries like Angela Davis and Audre Lorde, fed up with a country that was racist and sexist. But as these women marched, chanted, and conveyed their grievances, society called upon the angry black woman to Flanderize the real black women, dulling and reducing their criticism and complaints to that of the white noise of a loud and aggressive black woman. And that Flanderization has never left. Going back to Serena, why is it that her actions, her frustrations in that moment was met with the quite literal Flanderization of an angry black woman? Yet complaints levied by male athletes are at least given the time of day to permeate as valid and worthy of consideration. Look no further than John McEnroe. This tennis player was so well known, so famous for arguments and frustration on the court, especially with empires, that the man has a whole commercial where he's making fun of how often he did it. Literally look up
John McEnroe umpire commercial. It's a whole commercial with the big razor company about Mr. McEnroe. And he's like, you gotta be kidding me. Like, it's a whole thing. How is it that black women, in this instance Serena Williams, are universally hated and put down for exhibiting the same traits that their male and sometimes white female counterparts are praised and given commercials for? The sapphire stereotype continues to be used to ignore black women's voice, and as people much less high profile than Serena Williams face constant flanderization by partners, employers, family, and society. The caricatures of Jezebel, Mammy, and Sapphire have a dark and disguised history that has impacted black women centuries after they were fashioned in the minds of white society. Many are ignorant to these ghosts of slavery and unprepared to tackle their modern manifestations. With these falsities exposed, these assumptions and facades broken down to their racist and bigoted truth, what we are left with is this. Black women have always been more than their stereotypes. As white society bought into Mammy and built an institution of rape off of Jezebel propaganda, Harriet Tubman displayed a revolutionary strength, and Harriet Ann Jacobs survived to tell her tale. As podcast after podcast shows men ridiculing and reducing black women to angry and aggressive, the compassionate soul of Tarana Burke moved mountains, and her passion saved and brought justice to countless abuse victims. Black women have had their image, their name, their existence in a scroll by white society. Yet throughout this time, as caricatures, lies have come and gone. The truth has never been erased, never truly hidden. It shines brighter than a mask can cover and is prouder than any force can hold down. In returning to my letter, I speak again to you, black women. You have always been enough. And despite lies having filled our eyes and ears about you, you've always been there. It's time for a new image, painted by you and not to imitate you. Platforming and showcasing who you are, who you have always been, and the many people and ideas that you consist of, that all deserve the spotlight. Today, I platformed your imposter. And like any bad imitation, it couldn't stand the light. But that leaves us with an empty stage. The spotlight is now yours, black women. Fill it.